Ivy moved to the chair in front of Michael. Michael, hello. Michael and a few of the squad leaders were sitting scattered around the round table, and there happened to be an empty seat to Michael's right, where Ivy was sitting, unbiased. Jack had a colorful expression on his face, and a few of the other squad leaders were much like Jack. The girl's up to something, again this afternoon. That thing. Michael cared about Ivy's face, did not reprimand her in front of the crowd, just let her out of the column to stand in military posture, but Michael heart that angry this is the wing's hard dare to play in front of the Duke of Guan, thought he could not see her that little trick. Michael lifted his eyes to look at Ivy, who was smiling with an extraordinarily attentive. He held out his chopsticks and knocked on the side of her bowl. Eat properly. Ivy's in a good mood. Good. She lowered her head and took small bites of her meal, but perked up her ears and they ate without speaking, and it was a little dull. The Ivy simply put down her chopsticks and didn't eat, holding her cheeks and looking at Michael. Michael, I heard you don't have a girlfriend yet. Michael is single, in their troops is a well-known fact, but cannot resist people have a heart of gossip. A few squad leaders lowered their heads to pick up the rice, but the ears are particularly straight. The Michael's gaze held a warning glance at Ivy. The Ivy looked at him innocently, pretending to be puzzled and muttering in a low voice, was the news wrong? Michael, you have a girlfriend. The several squad leaders silently exchanged glances. Their chief of staff is a real bachelor. Where is the girlfriend? Cannot be blackmail. Completely let their chief of staff broken peach blossom. Oliver can't hold it in. Our chief of staff is single. In this way, Ivy pretended to be very sorry and surprised. Michael is so good looking. Why is he still single? Class president, you have to persuade him not to ask for too much. Who dares to persuade their chief? A couple of guys stifled their laughter and looked at each other. And Jack's the straightest. Chief, I think she's right. Michael put the chopsticks in his hand and said seriously, who taught you guys to gag during dinner? Meet at 6 o'clock tonight. Carry weights for 8 kilometers. A few people didn't react for a moment. Oliver said, Chief, we have to lead military training at 7 p.m. It won't run in an hour. Michael asked rhetorically. Listening and obeying is a requirement in the army. No one bargains for it. I'm done. Ivy rolls her eyes, physically punishing people at the drop of a hat. Michael gave her a look. You want to run, too? Ivy hurriedly buried her head and ate in silence. The Michael finished his meal and left first. Ivy came out of the cafeteria with Jack. Jack asked, Sister Ivy, do you have a crush on our chief of staff? If you don't have a crush, why do you keep asking our chief of staff about his feelings? Jack's a good kid. He looks frothy, but he's not that frothy. He's pretty smart. Ivy narrowed her eyes and laughed. Did I ever ask you about your feelings? The Jack asked. Isn't that right? Ivy patted him on the shoulder. Little comrade, asking about feelings isn't always about fancy, it's more likely to be about curiosity. The Jack realized, look at my brain, it's stupid. Oops, I've got to go run with weights. Ivy waved her hand. Go on, go on. After the subjects of the evening training, Ivy went to buy popsicles, together with Suamian and Sophia. The old popsicles from the Troopers Mini-Mart were $1 a pop, cool and thirst-quenching. Suamian saw that Ivy and Michael were sitting at the same table again in the afternoon, and was concerned that Michael didn't make you run laps again, did he? Ivy shook her head. Mian said he'll have to take a detour when he sees him from now on. Sophia laughed. It's not that much of a stretch. But it's true that Michael's a little tougher. Ivy laughed too. That's right. Tough as nails. On the way back out of the mini-mart, Ivy said she wanted to walk on her own, and Sophia and Suamian didn't doubt that Ivy had cornered Jack earlier and inquired about the building where the officers lived, downhill and uphill and to the left, and it wasn't long before they were there, and it wasn't very far. Ivy looked around the front of the building, and Jack said that Michael lived on the 3rd floor, and there were just 2 families on the 3rd floor, and neither of them had any lights on. It's so early. Can't be asleep. She stood downstairs in such a big way is a bit eye-catching, so she found a big tree, squatting next to it, training cap worn a little lower, so no one can notice her, but keeping a watchful eye. After waiting a few moments, the target appeared and Michael, still in his training uniform, walked forward with his hands in his pockets. Ivy walks out. Michael, what a coincidence. Michael could tell just by looking at her that the girl was up to no good, again. Unluckily. It's fate that we should meet. I can't take a walk without running into you. Michael snorted softly as the walk dispersed right down the hall from me. Who walks to this place at night when there's no scenery and no popularity? Ivy blinked. Yeah, it's such a coincidence. Michael, annoyed, reaches into his pants pocket and searches, pulling out a box of cigarettes and a lighter. He opened the cigarette case with one hand, drew one out, lit it, and the greenish-white smoke spread between the two. Ivy, with her full attention on Michael's hand, said nothing. Michael, however, suddenly put out his cigarette. Ivy didn't hate it when he smoked, but once upon a time he seldom smoked in front of her. He always thought it would smoke her and be bad for her health. It was the same now, and he found himself in no position to swallow openly at Ivy's say. What is it? Michael snapped. Ivy was blinded. Xiaojuan, if she's talking like this, something's wrong. This girl is usually so big and heartless that she seems to be able to get through anything, but Michael knows that she's fragile. 3 years ago, when Ivy suddenly ran away, it had more or less to do with this character, and when she would not state the reason, he was annoyed with her, and inclined to find out the cause of it. Andy really twisted my ankle this afternoon, she said glumly. Michael raised his chin. I know. The ankle was really hurting, and there were tears glistening in Ivy's eyes. The person who had previously greeted him with a playful smile, in a split second there were teardrops hanging on her face, and the pitiful appearance of the girl was particularly theatrical. They'd grown up together, Michael knew her inside out, and she knew he couldn't see to cry. Michael was half a meter away from Ivy, looking at her with complicated eyes. I know you're hurting, and then you punished me, Ivy complained. Michael let out a sudden laugh for some reason, and it still hurt when I held you down afterward. It hurts, it really hurts, it hurts. She bites off more than she can chew. This girl is a real force to be reckoned with. Michael got a little closer to Ivy, almost pressed his whole body against her. July, you're getting good at opening your eyes. There was so much gnashing of teeth in his words, and so much helplessness, and, it seemed, so much indulgence, that the Michael had not called her by her nickname since we met again, except to go along with her performance in front of her grandmother. Ivy's ears exploded and she drifted off into a trance, and there was an echo in the back of her mind of his clear, moist voice calling out the word July, and I am afraid there's no better sound in the world than this. There were footsteps not far away. It was the apartment where the officers lived, and there were not many people, but they came and went, Michael's acquaintances. Ivy hemmed and hawed and was about to say something when she was pushed and pulled by Michael, her whole back against the tree, and Michael then dodged over and pressed hard against her. The Ivy's back pressed against the rough trunk of the tree, choking it. Her eyes widened as she locked gazes with Michael, who watched her stoically. He could tell just by the look on her face that he'd hit her hard, that she was in real pain. She doesn't really feel aggrieved when she's in tears. She's really hurt when she's like a little hedgehog. The sound of footsteps faded, the acquaintance walked away. The Michael stifled a laugh and asked Ivy in a low voice, this time in real pain. Ivy also laughed, smiling like a flower. Yes, it always hurts. I have a white moonlight in my heart, but this white moonlight has been ignoring me. Michael, you say it hurts or not? Michael let go of her hand and took 2 steps back. Gazing at her silently for a few seconds, the corners of his mouth rose meaningfully. Ivy, have a good military training, don't be lazy. With those words, he took a giant stride toward the apartment and Ivy tried to go after them, but there were more people coming, and she couldn't, so she had to keep hiding behind the tree. She heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and the voice was Michael's at once, sharp, calm, quick, and Ivy picks up her cell phone and messages Olivia back, who asks her how the last few days of military training have been going. I was in Michael's unit, coincidentally, and I ran into that. Olivia, I'm coming to see you with David when I get home. Olivia's sunbathing on a beach in Fiji right now. She graduated from college and started her own business. To put it bluntly, she didn't want to go to work, couldn't stand the 9-to-5 life, all day long with a bunch of friends to play around, not a few times by her parents to teach her, but she just won't change. She's still doing what she's doing. This military training is not like the previous military training in high school and university. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the nature of the work is special, the military training requirements are strict, coupled with the encounter of Michael is solely responsible for, it is even more stringent. Military posture, formation, crawl forward are the most basic. In addition to these, running 3 kilometers every morning is also a must. I heard that later. There will be shooting, combat, high-altitude parachute jumping and other projects. For several days, the men and women of the ministry suffered from that afternoon. Jack took the men out on the range to practice their shooting. Jack went over the essentials of shooting, and then had a squad watch how the soldiers who were training shot, and watched them for almost half an hour before he began to let them practice. The Jack had a trooper take one man, one target each, and was issued a Type 95 rifle. The shooting hadn't even started yet, and Jack saw Michael coming and immediately gave a standard military salute. "Good day, Chief." Michael had other things on his mind and only occasionally took the time to check on the progress of the military training, his eyes roving around in front of the various targets just in time to see Ivy resting the butt of her rifle on her shoulder. "It hasn't started yet," reporting to the chief, "about to start." Michael nodded, and Jack gave a command. 10 rounds each, one at a time. There's smoke all over the range. When everyone had finished playing, the soldier who had been coaching them alongside them came to Michael and Jack to report everyone's scores. Jack's class was a bunch of girls, most of them from foreign languages, and their first time touching a gun, and no one expected them to shoot the hell out of it. When the grades were reported to Xingyu, the soldier paused for a moment and Jack said, "How much?" "You name it." 0 rings. Xingyu's eyes were full of incredulity when she heard her score. It couldn't be. Jack glanced at her. Xingyu pursed her lips, reporting to the instructor, "I think there's something wrong with my grades." The scores continue to be reported down the line. Ivy's over 100 rings. A group of people can be considered to understand. Xingyu, this is to put their own bullets to the next door Ivy's target. By all accounts, Ivy was quite aggravated that someone else was shooting at her target, and she didn't even know her real score. Well, she didn't care about that, and only smiled ebulliently as she met Michael's gaze. Michael had a warning in his gaze, meaning "Don't you fuck with me." Ivy spread her hands, meaning "It's got nothing to do with me." After a few days of training, Ivy has become a famous prick in this military training. The other two squad leaders know Ivy old trouble, every time by the chief of staff caught. Last time this unlucky girl was also the chief of staff was punished to run 8 laps. To say it is also strange. This girl is usually quite well behaved, in the team to be peaceful and quiet, but every time Michael comes, she's a fool. Over here, Xingyu broke down all of a sudden. No matter what others said, she didn't believe it. The dormitory and the people sort of understand Xingyu's temperament. Xingyu high-minded and proud, and with whom to get along with people like a fight, especially to Ivy. Her hostility is especially obvious. The crowd was silent for a moment and Ivy suggests that maybe we should let Sojetsu have another go at it. The squad of men looked at Michael, and Jack waited for Michael to give his orders. Michael contemplated for a moment. Xingyu, Ivy, all playing one more time. The Jack called for 2 soldiers and took the 2 men back to at the word of command. The shots rang out. Ivy finished her 10 rounds sharply, handed her gun to the soldier who had brought her own, and walked to the line. That Xingyu was still prostrate on the ground, aiming at the target, slow to pull the trigger. Her forehead was covered with sweat. She shot extremely slowly. Each shot took a few minutes to fire. Everyone's eyes were on her. After the last gunshot, Xingyu slowly got up and handed his gun to the soldier beside him. The 2 soldiers immediately ran over to the target to see how the 2 had done. Seeing the results, the soldier jogged all the way to Michael and saluted, reporting to the chief, "Xingyu 49 rings, Ivy 50 rings. There you go. The 2 of them don't add up to 100." Ivy doesn't have much of a look on her face. Not a good or bad score. Since she was a little girl, she has been taken to the range by John to shoot at targets, and has always been such a score, and she has no desire to win or lose, and target shooting is just for fun, to relieve stress. To Xingyu's face was ugly, her eyes were full of tears, and she looked straight at Michael. Shu Mian despised, but also not their own fight out, so look at Michael what to do. Michael gave a token reassuring word to keep up the good work, and turned his head to talk to Jack about stepping up his training. Xingyu couldn't hold herself together on the spot, and 2 lines of tears flowed down her face. Ivy's handing her a tissue. "Here, wipe it off." Xingyu didn't take it, and with a wave of her hand knocked Ivy's hand down, and Ivy didn't care, folding the tissue paper in half and tossing it into the trash can beside her. Michael didn't leave. He continued to watch the training. Ivy had just gotten down on the ground, and hadn't even propped the snatch up on her shoulder, when she saw a pair of army boots appear to her right. The owner must have been a meticulous man, too, with his shiny military boots and tightly tied laces. The soldier at Ivy's side immediately stood up and saluted. "Good day, sir." There was a soft hum from the top of his head. Ivy's hand trembled for a moment and she could guess Michael's movements as he looked down at her. She suddenly felt like she was lying on a hot pan, and even the gun in her hand was boiling hot now. The wrists naturally close inward, right elbow on the ground and brace outward, arm perpendicular to the ground. Ivy froze for a couple of seconds. Realizing with the benefit of hindsight that Michael was teaching her, she did as he said, adjusting her posture, and suddenly, Michael crouches down. No. Ivy tilted her head sideways to the right and looked up at Michael quizzically. Michael raised an eyebrow, a rare faint smirk at the corner of his mouth, all that target shooting for nothing, and he reached out, manipulating Ivy's hand and shoulder so as to minimize the effect of the gun on his wrist. He's so good looking. He's got a great voice. Ivy's attention had gone completely off the gun. Michael helped her adjust her position, and she slowly relaxed, took aim, pulled the trigger, and it's just that Ivy got selfish and wanted Michael to stay by her side a little longer, moving slower than Xingyu ever did. Michael Shang sort of had some patience, and just let Ivy shoot 4 or 5 rounds. A class of people were finished, and then only she and Xingyu were left. Xingyu, because the first 2 scores are very ugly, and she is particularly important to the results, she simply do not dare to just pull the trigger and lead to slow movements. Ivy, on the other hand, because of Michael. Michael squatted and watched for a while, and realized that the girl was not afraid of getting a bad grade, but clearly did not want to fight, and was dawdling with him. Michael looked at his watch and bent down to remind Ivy that there were 5 rounds left. Ivy raised her eyes to his as well, and his dark eyes looked like deep pools of. She said, "I'm gonna play nice." The range was so big that the next targets were empty, and the soldier in charge of Ivy had been standing behind the 2 men, sweating his head off from the big sun. Michael knocks on the ground with his hand. "Ivy, no tricks, you have 3 minutes to finish the fight." Okay. The skirmishers behind us are stunned. Michael raised an eyebrow and stood up, motioning for Ivy's grades to be looked at. Ring 79. Michael looked deeply at Ivy, and Ivy winks. It's all because of Michael's good direction. Ivy and Jack were sitting on the steps of the training ground, cooling off. During the evening training break, the 2 talked about Michael. Jack asked, "Ivy's sister, you and the chief of staff know, he can all see, when shooting, the chief of staff has been to Ivy to correct the posture of it. Which girl has had this kind of treatment?" Ivy nodded, her eyes glowing with recognition. Jack's face was puzzled, and his mind turned over and over. And a million thoughts sprang up. I know his ex-girlfriend. I don't know him very well. Ivy said. Jack was dumbfounded. The chief of staff really did have an ex-girlfriend. After a pause, he lowered his voice. "The chief of staff has been single since I've known him," and Ivy curled the corners of her mouth to stifle a laugh. "What's going on?" "We all thought that the chief of staff is celibacy." Jack looked around, see nothing, and deliberately lowered his voice a little bit, and then "I heard that the chief of staff, in the heart of someone, has not forgotten." And the girl broke up. "The chief of staff, every mission with no life like Rush had one." His tone some regret. "I have seen the girl's photo, do not say, is really beautiful." Where did you meet?" The chief of staff had a picture of the girl in his wallet. "I wonder if it's still there." When Ivy graduated from high school, she put a picture in Michael's wallet. It was the picture on her high school diploma. She was wearing a white shirt, her long hair was all tucked behind her ear, she smiled showing her white teeth. It was very quiet and sweet. She especially liked that picture, and she insisted on shoving a copy of it into Michael's wallet. And she was so happy to see that she was able to get a copy of it. Michael said he didn't like it, but he actually treasured the picture, and Ivy remembered that once David tried to look at it, and Michael immediately closed his wallet to keep anyone else from looking at it. And then, no matter how many times Michael changed wallets, that picture stayed in his wallet. But 3 years ago, when she walked away, she thought he'd throw that picture away. Jack should have just looked at it. He didn't even see the real person in the photo right in front of him. Or is it just that time has passed and she's faded and matured? Ivy's teasing Jack. "Is that girl pretty? How does she compare to me?" Jack took a serious look at Ivy. "Not as pretty as you." Ivy knocked him hard. "Why isn't she prettier than me?" "My friend's very pretty." The young squad leader was baffled. "You can't praise someone's beauty nowadays." "Sister Ivy, I'm telling the truth." Ivy rested her cheeks. She was prettier now than she'd ever been before. "Do you think I can be your chief of staff's girlfriend?" Jack's jaw dropped. "The chief of staff isn't your friend's ex-boyfriend. They all broke up." Yeah. Ivy usually spoke to Jack like this, 3 parts sincerity, 4 parts joke, and Jack, shocked, didn't take it personally. Military training as usual, except that Ivy hadn't seen Michael since that day of target shooting. Ivy cornered Jack, who was tight-lipped this time, and wouldn't say anything, no matter how hard he asked. Having been cornered by Ivy, Jack let it slip that the chief of staff was off on a mission. To what mission? Jack clenched his teeth, Ivy pursed her lips and stopped asking questions, and surely not an easy task to accomplish. Ivy met Andrew on the training ground. Jack had given them a 10-minute break, and Ivy was chatting with a couple of the girls in her class, when Susie tugged at her cuffs, showing her that officer is so handsome. Andrew was sweating in a training suit with a group of guys practicing who knew what they were doing. Ivy put down her water and stood up before hurrying over to the Andrew. Ivy had a good voice, and so shouted that the soldiers Andrews had brought stopped and lifted a pair of eyes to survey her. The person is even better looking, although much tanned and wearing a camouflage, but that soft beauty with a hint of fortitude added to it. The Andrew was a little agitated and sent a group of soldiers off to run laps, and then turned around and asked, "What's going on?" He had just come back from a business trip, and was wondering about something like being able to see Ivy on the unit, but on second thought, he probably realized in his heart Michael was also the main instructor for this foreign ministry's military training. Still, there was nothing good about seeing Ivy. Andrew. "Where did Michael go?" Ivy asked him, tilting her head, looking as if she wouldn't stop until she had a question or two or three. No comment. Ivy's all, "Andrew, just tell me about it," she says, playfully. "That worked on Michael." "It didn't work on me." Andrew's not budging. Time went by. Ivy got anxious. "Andrew, I'm worried about little brother Juan. I haven't seen him for over a week now. I haven't seen him in a month." Andrew disliked it. Ivy folded her hands together slightly. "Is he off on a mission? I'm really worried about him." And Andrew looked at Ivy, and the serious look on her face didn't seem fake. He knew that Michael, seemingly oblivious, hadn't let go of Ivy. Toes rubbing back and forth on the floor, he suddenly voiced, "Ivy, now that you're back, don't run. Michael's hurt, in the military general hospital." The Ivy panicked all of a sudden. "Minor injuries, get back to training." Andrew looked over at Jack's side, already assembled. Ivy pursed her lips and took a step back and forth, and the people were back, but her heart flew out of her mouth when Andrew said that Michael was hurt. She'd been up all afternoon, and her heart felt like it was on fire. "It's hard." She finally relented and reported to Jack for leave of absence. Jack asked what it was about, and she thought for a moment, and said, fretfully, "I've got something going on at home, and I've got to get back to the." Jack had watched Ivy run over to talk to Andrew earlier, and thought she was going to get into some kind of trouble in front of the chief again, but luckily, there was no trouble. And the people came back when they assembled, but they came back as if they'd lost their minds. The Jack can't take a leave of absence. He has to report it up the chain of command, and they're quick to approve it. This is a suburb of Washington. The transportation is not convenient. Ivy cannot care so much. Clothes are not changed. Not long out of the camp, hit a black car, that at this point in the day, when Washington's traffic jams are at their worst, a waterfall of cars are parked on the road, their headlights so bright they're blinding, that it was hard to get to the hospital before Ivy realized she didn't even know which ward Michael was in. She pulled out her cell phone to do a little digging, but she managed to find Andrew's number, dialed it, and "Andrew, what room is Michael in?" Andrew gave her a direct line to which ward and which building. Michael's hospital room was on the 5th floor. The elevator was there in no time. Ivy found the room number Andrew had told her. The door was left open, it opened a crack, and the sound of someone talking came out from inside. Ivy moved closer to the doorway and inside. There was only one hospital bed, and Michael was half recumbent on it, too far away for Ivy to see his face, but he was moving in a stretched-out manner, and he certainly didn't look like he had too much of a problem. There was someone sitting in the chair beside his bed, a woman nonetheless, her back to the door, and Ivy couldn't tell who it was, and the woman spoke, "Freshly peeled apple, here you go." She held out her thin wrist and put the rounded peeled apple to Michael's mouth. The voice on the other end was warm and magnetic, and Ivy could hear who she was. Michael raised his eyes lazily. "I don't eat apples." The corners of Ivy's mouth curved. This guy was good, and he had the company of a famous anchor. She breathed a sigh of relief, and her hand on the doorknob fell away, then turned to go downstairs and take a cab back to the campground. Chapter 4. Unforgettable. Ivy had left in such a hurry, and returned so late in the evening, that she could not avoid being greeted with concern, and after she answered one by one that she was fine, the world was finally quiet. The Xingyu was practicing her speaking along with the audio. wearing headphones, and even though the dormitory was noisy just now, she wasn't the least bit fazed by it. As she Mian came to Ivy's side to gossip. Sister, you know that person, ah. Ivy took her cell phone to read today's current affairs, which, that officer, whispered Sumian. The Ivy laughed softly, recognizing that Sumian let out a whimper. Thought you were talking to him because you were looking at him. She poked Ivy again. What about Michael? You're always looking for trouble in front of him. The Ivy raised her eyes to look at Sumian and smiled playfully. Well, looking at him. The Sumian was so shocked that she jumped up and covered her mouth tightly. The Xingyu looked up and glanced this way, and muttered something under her breath. Ivy and Suamian looked at each other and didn't say another word. The subject practiced on this day was creeping, in which a group of people had to reach a target location in a specific position, with various obstacles on the way. The girls in the class thought it was pretty funny to watch while Jack was demonstrating, but when it was their turn, it wasn't so easy. The barbed wire is right above the body, and if you're not careful, you're going to get zapped. At first there were a few complaints, but seeing Jack's serious expression, they could only prostrate themselves on the ground after the other man had given the order to a class full of dainty, big girls, usually dainty and delicate, who now had to crawl on their backs on the dirt-covered grass. The Sumian climbed while talking to the people around him. Since childhood, this is the real military training. Sophia smiled in bittersweet amusement and said, no, it's grown on you. Ivy didn't participate in their conversation, just moved cautiously, thinking of Michael. The top is full of barbed wire. Sumian watched Ivy being stabbed several times and still no reaction at all. Couldn't help but remind, sister. Stabbed to the Ivy grunted, yes it hurt a little. She grabbed a handful of grass and threw it forward. Forget it. Don't think about it. Not far away, Michael looked at Ivy, crawling under the barbed wire, as dumb as a bug, and he raised his chin and asked Jack, meaningfully, that's how you've been training them these past few days? Jack froze for a moment and turned to look at Michael, somewhat at a loss for words. Chief, training for this program has only just begun. Michael licked his lips, only beginning to be able to dumb it down like she was. Jack followed Michael's line of sight, and it was Ivy, the prick. With a little pain in his brain, Michael didn't wait for Jack to answer, and took a big step to the other end of the barbed wire fence. That Michael's waist and legs are long, good-looking, camouflage pants under the stride of the long legs. I do not know how many already climbed to the end of the rest on the side of the girl. Ivy had something on her mind, stifling her crawling, and when her body was out of the barbed wire fence, she looked up slightly and saw a pair of polished military boots in front of her eyes. Thinking it was Jack, she didn't think much of it, and braced her hands on the ground, ready to rise, when the owner of the boots took 2 steps back, and the somewhat low voice reached her ears. Ivy, you're so prostrate. It's Michael. Ivy stood up slightly unsteadily, patted the dirt on her hands, and answered, rightly, yes. Michael stood erect, and said, with a single word, if you were on the field of battle, you'd be staked out by the obstacles first. The Ivy's back ached vaguely, and she didn't have the heart to retort. Go, Michael said. Where to go? Infirmary. Not going. Michael's gaze was fixed firmly on Ivy. The Ivy looked around and explained that it wasn't that bad, just a couple of zaps. That Michael sneered, obeying orders. Jack didn't tell you that. Their conversation was not loud enough for those around them to hear it in a blur, just a vague sense that the atmosphere wasn't very good. The Simian waved his hand at Ivy one by one. Without further argument, Ivy followed Michael with her head down. Andrew called Michael the other day and said he had told Ivy about his injury, and Ivy immediately took a leave of absence from the team and ran to the hospital. The more he mulled it over, the stranger it seemed. He'd been in a hospital bed, but he'd never seen Ivy. Then he figured out what was going on, and for a moment he couldn't tell what was going on in his heart. The army training ground to the infirmary is a certain distance. The 2 people all the way to the silence. Ivy first cannot stand, spoke up, just stuck in the barbed wire, really do not need to go to the infirmary. Michael paused in his steps and stopped in front of Ivy, snorting, not if you say you don't have to. Ivy bristled and didn't say another word. Her back was really tingling a bit. I don't know how long we've been walking, but we've finally reached the infirmary. The corpsman in the infirmary, a woman of about 40, seeing Michael bring a young and pretty girl, struck with wonder, and asked, what brings Michael here today? Michael politely greeted people. Dr. Luo brought people to see the doctor. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs put on this side of the military training of the little girl. Not at all let a person worry, his tone of voice some helpless, but also some indefinable ambiguity. Dr. Luo's eyes flicked over and over on Ivy's body. The little girl had taken care of the unit's notorious oldest problem. The Ivy pursed her lips and told Dr. Luo that she had just been stabbed by a wire while practicing prostration. Dr. Luo looked at Michael's eyes, more gratifying smile, like a woman of her age. These young men in the unit's lifelong affairs are more or less a bit gossipy. Michael was calm, raised his hand and rubbed the tip of his nose with his index finger, said nothing, and Dr. Rowe gave a little laugh, and said, Michael will wait outside, and the little girl will come in. And Ivy obediently went into the consulting room, and Dr. Rowe pulled the curtain back, allowing Ivy to take off her jacket and lift up her army green t-shirt again, revealing all the areas that had been caught in the barbed wire while she was creeping forward. Not too big a thing, Dr. Luo in the army infirmary work, injured into what kind of have not seen, but the little girl was born white, at this time on the back of all the traces of being scratched, inevitably let a person's heartache. Dr. Luo first took iodophor to wipe Ivy's wound, and then put on some anti-inflammatory ointment, while applying the medicine and talking to Ivy. Michael is also really, do not know the pity, but this is the first time that Michael brought a girl to the infirmary, said, she laughed at herself first, but, we do not have a few girls here, but the girl is not a good person, but the girl is not a good person. But the girl is not a good person. Ivy's back hurt a little, she gently frowned, but still, and Dr. Luo joked, yes, there are not many little girls in this mountain, he wanted to bring cannot bring a. Dr. Luo thinks Ivy is quite interesting, and there are quite a few leaders in the unit who have introduced girls to Michael. None of it made it, and Ivy lay on her back and let Dr. Rowe medicate her. Dr. Luo medicine finished, turned around and threw the cotton swabs into the trash can, sighed, did not become, look at Michael's little girl more, it is he cannot see people. Ivy laughed too. He's the one with the bad temper. Dr. Luo said goodbye, and while helping Ivy up to get dressed, he instructed that he should try not to let the wound touch water again for the next few days. Dr. Rowe opened the door, only to see Michael standing in the doorway with a straight posture, like a tree, his head hung slightly, and he didn't know what he was thinking about, but even so, he still made people feel very spiritual, and the moment the door opened, Michael looked up just in time to meet Ivy on all fours. Ivy got a little angry when she remembered the day she saw Michael at the hospital, and moved her gaze away for just a second. The Dr. Luo see two people like this, feel the atmosphere is not right, smiled and rounded off, Michael, people back to you, the medicine is good, nothing serious, pay attention to point on the line, the girl is not your hands under those soldiers, do not so train again. Michael, not being stupid, could hear the concern and snark in Dr. Rowe's tone and licked his lips and said, got it, Dr. Rowe. The scene on the way back was reversed from the way in, with Ivy walking briskly in front and Michael following unhurriedly behind. Ivy was tall for a girl, but Michael was taller and had longer legs, and she always took smaller steps than Michael. Michael, like a cat and mouse, just neither up nor down. Finally, it was Ivy who couldn't hold it together. Michael, you've got so much time on your hands today. The man behind her was slow to speak, and Ivy turned away with some impatience, and Michael's footsteps came to a halt. He didn't avoid her gaze either, lifting his eyes, absently, and after a moment asked, a little sluggishly, to the hospital. The Ivy bristled, and said, in an evil voice, no. Michael's tone was 2 degrees higher, no. It seemed to be Andrew who had already told him, and Ivy felt that there was nothing more to hide from him. Yeah, go for it. What's up? Michael's dark eyes were suddenly tinged with mirth, and his thin lips curled slightly upward, seeing something. Michael is doing this on purpose. Ivy looked at Michael with her arms folded and a smile on her face, too, and saw that Grace not waiting for Michael to reply. Ivy continued to laugh and said, Michael is so lucky to be injured in the line of duty and have the anchor in the hospital with him. Michael curbed his laughter and explained seriously that she had come here on her own, and that she had heard somewhere that the apple was peeled by her, and that it was hard to eat. Michael explaining to her that. Ivy looked at Michael. In front of her, the person was still the same, but it was clear that she felt different from when she had just returned to the country. You don't have to explain yourself to me. Michael smiled and licked his lips, explaining, sort of. Ivy doesn't want to pay attention to Michael, turns around and continues on her way. Make yourself at home, I've got training to do. Michael followed her up in 3 steps and walked to her side, having the energy to train now, having just trained thinking about what could zap himself like that, and Ivy sulked and belabored, still thinking of you. Michael looked at her face, she seemed a little unhappy, his voice was a little low, said. Don't think about anything, train well, and Ivy paused in her steps and looked sideways at Michael's handsome face. The question that she had been holding back for many days finally came out, where did you hurt? From the time he went out on a mission, he had suffered all kinds of injuries, big and small. Just a few days ago, Michael did not put it in his heart, and did not intend to hide it from Ivy. I just didn't think she'd ask.